Hi, I'm Timmy Hamilton, and I'm going to show you how to smoke a brisket on the Weber. And I'm going to start from the very beginning so that anybody who hasn't done this before can at least see how I do it. And I've competed in a lot of competitions, won a lot of ribbons doing this, so it's a pretty tested method. What we're going to have is basically two sets of prep. One is prepping the brisket, and the second is going to be prepping the grill. So I'll show you prepping the grill here in a second. What I do is I trim the fat off the brisket, stuff my garlic and rosemary. I'm going to use garlic and rosemary to stuff into pieces in the brisket, and I'm going to use a long lancing knife to sort of put some cavities that I can shove these rosemary and garlic pieces into. I'm going to trim off the fat so that I have somewhat of a thin layer, and then I'm going to put a barbecue rub or spice over the top of it. When I get ready to do the rub, that's when I go and prep my grill, because I know that takes about 10 minutes. Getting the charcoal going and the hickory on top of it takes about 10 minutes. So let's get started. This is a about 9.5 pound brisket. I like to keep them around 10 pounds. When you get smaller than that, you don't get much meat. When you get bigger than that, when you get the 13, 15 pounders, you find you have lots and lots of fat. When you go to pick out a brisket, you can look at the side. You can see what the layer of fat is on the side. See, that's pretty thick fat. That fat is as big as the meat portion is. So if you can, try to avoid that. What you want to have is one that's more like this, that has a thinner layer. That's probably what we're going to want to have, is maybe an 1/8 of an inch fat on top of our brisket, or meat to our brisket. So let me cut this and get started here. The other prep thing I want to show you here is on the rosemary. I want to keep the rosemary at about 3 inches or so, about the width of my hand. So I'm going to clip this to have those pieces at about that size. And then I'm going to use some of the spare little pieces of rosemary. I'm going to strip those off, and those are going to go into our rub. So this one here also, about a 3-inch piece. And I got just a little spare here. So those are going to be my rosemary pieces. And these I'm going to cut up into little tiny pieces that are going to go into my rub. My rub is a homemade rub that I use. There's a lot of good commercial rubs out there. One of the things I want to tell you about when you start doing rubs is keep your salt content down. That's why I use my friend Key West Spice Company, Tony Lazarus, his spices. I don't think he has salt in there. Oh, he has a little bit of salt, but it's a second or third ingredient on his, so that you have very low salt content. So I'm going to dice these up and put these in here. As for my garlic, I'm going to try and put these into pieces that are about this size. As you can see, that's about the size I want to have. So if I have a big fat piece of garlic, I'm going to cut this so that I can get them in those little smaller little bullet pieces of width that I can shove them into the actual cavities I'm going to make. You need to have a very sharp knife in order to do this. You can see now that you're holding it, see it's fairly thin on this side, so I really don't need to carve much here, but there always is a big layer of fat back there. So I'm going to want to get that off, and I see I have a lot of fat over here, so I'm going to try and trim this down. And when you're trimming it, you can see where the meat is just barely through the membrane of the fat. That's about the level that I want. I want a little bit of fat on the brisket because I want it to be moist, and I want the fat to continue to keep the meat moist. So I don't want to trim it all off, so I'm not a fan of a completely trimmed brisket. I like to have a little bit on there so that it has a little bit of constant oil from the fat dripping into the meat itself, because when we put this on the grill, we're going to have the fat side up and gravity's going to pull that through. So I'm going to continue to trim this. Okay, so I've finished trimming my brisket here. I did want to show one last piece of trimming. There is a big triangular piece of fat here between the flat end and the back end, and so it's a sort of a triangular piece of fat. I trim that out of there because I think it inhibits some of the smoke and flavor from getting into the brisket. So next up, we're going to stuff our brisket. This is where I use the long lancing knife with my garlic and my rosemary. So I'm just going to randomly pick some places here. I'm going to shove my knife in there, and I'm going to take a piece of garlic and put that in where that was. I like to fill a garlic cavity and try and shove them in there as far as you can, and then do a set of rosemary cavities. And I'm just sort of picking 3 or 4 inches from place to place along, and I'm going to do it from both sides. I keep my thumb where I'm going to be stuffing it. Some people will do this ahead of time and go ahead and have their brisket stuffed overnight. I was used to competing in these barbecue contests where you got to check your meat in as soon as you pull your vehicle into the premises, so you're not allowed to pre-stuff or pre-marinate or pre-rub your meats. You've got to do it right there on spot. So I just got used to doing it right before I'm going to smoke it. Don't worry about damaging the meat when you do this, because it's going to come out just fine. A couple pieces of garlic left, and I started with probably about 4 cloves of garlic. Only have one tiny piece of garlic left, so I'm going to put this in here and start with my first rosemary. I'm using sprigs that are fairly mature, so there's not a lot of flexibility, but there is a lot of leaves on these. So I might have to widen that up. This is probably the toughest part of stuffing it, is getting the rosemary in there. I don't mind seeing it on the outside. And I want to pick a place aside from where I lanced my garlic. I think that was my garlic hole. So there we go. So we got all our garlic and our rosemary in there. The rosemary that was left, I diced up and put in the top of my rub. So I'm going to stir that around and use that when I put the rub over the top. But now it's time to go prep the grill, which is the other part. We want to make sure, since we're going to do indirect heat, so the brisket's going to be over a pan of water, and the coals and the hickory are going to be to the side of that. Same concept works on those big smokers where they have the separate smoke box. The smoke box is away from the meat, so it's indirect. So let's go do that. Okay, so I'm out here. I'm using the large Weber. I've stacked my coals on one side. I have my water pan on the other side. Normally I like to use one of the charcoal chimneys. I own 3 charcoal chimneys. I can't find any of them. So I'm a lot more organized in making the meat than storing the supplies for the meat. But there we go. So I'm going to do a little bit of charcoal lighter on this so that this will burn. I want to make sure that all of the lighter is burned off, and then all of the charcoals, they start off a plume of gases when they ignite. I want to make sure all that's gone by the time I put my brisket on. That's the beauty of having the chimney. We can add some additional coals to the fire without having to restart the whole thing. We can start those on the side. We're going to go ahead and let this get going. This is going to take about 10 minutes. And while I do this, I'm going to go ahead and rub that brisket, because that's going to take some time. By the time I get that rubbed, then this should be ready for dispersing the coals, and we'll put the brisket on top. Okay, so we've got our fire going outside now. I've got my rub here. There are a lot of commercial rubs, as I mentioned. I mix my own up. The base of this is primarily paprika and garlic powder, although I do supplement a little bit with my friend Tony's Key West Spice Company. I put a little Island Grill in this one also. He has another one called the Southernmost Blend. That one works really good with brisket. But I've got my own mix of some other spices that I have in there, and I've just tossed in my rosemary. I'm going to rub this over the top of this cutting board, mainly for demonstration purposes. Normally what I would do is I would do this over the top of the sink, and then I would put this in this bowl and carry it to the grill on the bowl. But in this case, I'm using the cutting board mainly just to show the rubbing that we're going to do. So, and there are these containers that have the sort of sprinkle thing for you. That's always nice. I like to put it into a little separate cup so I can just sort of have a little more thickness of control over it, and then I like to add to these different rubs. So we just want to make sure this gets rubbed in there. It will adhere to it naturally. You don't need to oil it down. Some pieces of meat, you know, you need to put olive oil or something to sort of get it to adhere. With a brisket, the same with a pork shoulder, pork loin, there's enough natural residual fats that it's going to stick to it. Now, how much rub is always a question of personal question for the chef. I like to have it to where I can still see the meat, but the rub is predominant throughout. I've cooked next to somebody who was a championship brisket competitor, and they put a 1/4 inch of rub on top of the brisket, but then they smoked for like 10 hours. So the more rub you put on, there's probably some ratio there for someone smarter than me that can figure out how much you do that. But I've got that pretty well dusted, so I want to rub that in as much as possible. The neglected areas are usually the sides. Okay, so let's close the camera in here, and you can see at least how I've thoroughly rubbed it, but it's not super thick, but it's all the way consistently throughout the meat. Okay, next I'm going to carry this out. Our grill should be just about ready to go, and we'll put this on the grill.